In this mini tutorial we're going to have a look at the very basic structure of the central and peripheral nervous systems, and also take a look at how they connect with one another. So we're going to start off by drawing a very simple diagram of the central nervous system. So here I'm drawing the brain, brainstem and spinal cord going on, cerebellum at the back there, like that. So this is just a very simple cartoon of the entire central nervous system. Firstly, I'd like to point out this large structure here at the most rostral end of the CNS, which is the cerebral hemisphere. So this is the cerebral hemisphere, and it is within the cerebral hemispheres that most of our higher mental faculties occur. So for example, memory, learning and emotions. And the cerebral hemispheres have a number of different parts to them known as lobes. So for example, this lobe here sitting most anteriorly is the frontal lobe, which is involved in higher thought, problem solving for example. This part here more posteriorly is called the occipital lobe, which is involved in vision. And this part here more laterally is the temporal lobe, which is involved in memory and emotion. Sitting more caudally to the cerebral hemispheres, we have the brainstem. So this structure, which I'm bracketing here, is known as the brainstem. And the brainstem is primarily involved with automatic functions, so for example breathing, regulation of the autonomic nervous system, and it's also involved in other functions such as regulation of continence. Now the brainstem has three major divisions. Where I'm drawing this red blob here, this is known as the midbrain. So the midbrain is the most rostral part of the brainstem. Where I'm putting this blue blob here, this is known as the pons. So this is in an intermediate position. And where I'm putting the green blob down here, the most caudal part of the brainstem, this is known as the medulla. So those are the three major divisions of the brainstem, and they tend to have different functions. So for example, an important function of the midbrain is to control various nerves which move the eyes. An important function of the pons is to control the nerves which help us to chew. And an important function of the medulla is in regulation of the autonomic nervous system. Whilst we're considering the brainstem, we shouldn't also forget the presence of the cerebellum sitting more posteriorly, which I've coloured here in orange. And the cerebellum is absolutely essential for proper coordinated muscle activity. If you have a problem with your cerebellum, you are not able to coordinate your muscles properly. Finally, we have the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is involved in a number of functions. Two important ones are the transmission of information from the cerebral hemispheres down to the peripheral nervous system, and it also mediates various reflexes. So these are the so-called spinal reflexes, for example the knee-jerk reflex that many of you will have seen. Now the spinal cord has emerging from it many pairs of so-called spinal nerves. So here I'm just depicting a few of these so-called spinal nerves. And spinal nerves contain two different types of axon. They contain motor axons, which are involved in controlling voluntary muscles, and they also contain sensory axons which bring back sensory information. In fact, there is a third type of axon as well, these being axons which are part of the autonomic nervous system, which you'll cover in more depth at a later point in the course. But in red we have the so-called spinal nerves. Now, spinal nerves can do something very interesting, because it is not the case that each individual spinal nerve supplies just one muscle. What spinal nerves can do is they can actually merge together in this kind of way to form what is known as a plexus. So spinal nerves can merge together to form a plexus, so that each of these individual nerves emerging from the plexus themselves supply a given muscle. Now, on the surface this might seem like a very messy way to do things, until you think about what might happen if there were damage to one of the individual spinal nerves. So if we think about, say, if there were damage to this spinal nerve here, still there are a number of pathways allowing us to supply all of these muscles. So the presence of a plexus allows us to have some redundancy in the system. It allows us to have a backup plan if there should be damage at one particular level. In addition to spinal nerves, there are also nerves emerging from the brain and brainstem itself, which I'm depicting here in green. These nerves emerging from the brain are known as cranial nerves. So these are the cranial nerves which emerge directly from the brain itself. And typically, cranial nerves supply structures which are only found in the head and neck. There are one or two exceptions, but it's almost universal that cranial nerves supply structures in the head and neck. An important exception to this is the vagus nerve, which of course goes into the abdomen and thorax. So, for example, some cranial nerves supply muscles that move the eyes. Some cranial nerves supply the tongue. Now, just like the spinal nerves, some cranial nerves are both sensory and motor together. Some cranial nerves are just sensory, and some cranial nerves are just motor. So they have some similarities to spinal nerves, but they have some differences, that being some of them are either purely sensory or purely motor. But in common with spinal nerves, some of the cranial nerves can themselves form plexuses. So we can still form a plexus even with cranial nerves. So I hope this short mini tutorial has been useful to you, and as always, please feel free to leave some feedback. Thank you.